What happens when a mysterious luxury car pulls up to a struggling family's home, the day after their teenage son defends an elderly stranger? Hidden connections surface, destinies intertwined, and a shocking revelation changes multiple lives forever. What drives a young man to risk everything for a stranger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees of Riverdale, a modest neighborhood in the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, as Christopher Harris made his way to work. His worn jacket offered little protection against the wind, but he pressed on, mindful of his mother Diana and little brother James waiting at home. Every dollar he earned at the local grocery store mattered. His mother's nursing salary barely covered their rent and utilities, leaving little room for extras or emergencies. Life hadn't been easy since his father's passing 3 years ago. Their small apartment, once filled with laughter and weekend barbecues, now echoed with the constant worry of unpaid bills and mounting debts. But Christopher refused to let hardship dim his spirit. At 14, he'd learned to shoulder responsibilities beyond his years, dividing his time between school, work, and helping care for 8-year-old James. As Christopher turned onto Maple Street, the familiar route to Morton's grocery where he worked after school, cruel laughter pierced the afternoon quiet. 3 older teens, Kyle, Derek, and Jason, had cornered an elderly Asian man near the community park. Christopher recognized them immediately. They were notorious troublemakers at Riverdale High, known for targeting vulnerable people in the neighborhood. The elderly man stood with quiet dignity, despite his obvious fear, his silver hair catching the sunlight as he gripped his walking cane. The bullies circled him like vultures, pulling at his expensive jacket and mocking his accent. "Hey, old man, this is our neighborhood," Kyle sneered, shoving the man's shoulder. "Maybe you should go back to where you came from." Christopher's hands clenched into fists. He knew getting involved could mean trouble. These guys had connections, and their parents were influential in the community. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him to stay out of trouble, to think of James, to remember that they couldn't afford any problems. But watching the elderly man's trembling hands and hearing the quiet dignity in his voice as he tried to reason with the bullies awakened something in Christopher that wouldn't let him walk away. Time seemed to slow as Christopher weighed his options. He was already running late for his shift at Morton's, and Mr. Morton had warned him about tardiness. One more strike, and he could lose his job. The rational part of his brain urged him to keep walking. It wasn't his problem, and he had his own family to worry about. But his father's words, spoken so many years ago, rang clear in his memory. "Son, courage isn't about being fearless, it's about doing what's right, especially when you're scared." Taking a deep breath, Christopher dropped his backpack and stepped forward. "Hey!" he called out, his voice stronger than he felt. "Leave him alone!" The bullies turned, surprise flickering across their faces before settling into malicious grins. The elderly man's eyes met Christopher's, filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. In that moment, neither of them could have imagined how this chance encounter would set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. Kyle and his gang advanced toward Christopher, their faces twisted with cruel amusement. "Well, well," Kyle sneered, cracking his knuckles. "Looks like someone needs to learn their place." The elderly man, Dr. Walter Chen, though Christopher didn't know his name yet, tried to step between them, his cane wobbling slightly on the uneven pavement. "Please, young men," Dr. Chen said, his voice carrying years of authority despite his current vulnerability. "There's no need for violence. This boy was simply trying to help." But the bullies ignored him, focused entirely on Christopher now. Christopher's heart hammered in his chest, but he stood his ground. He might not be as big as Kyle and his friends, but years of helping at the local youth center had taught him a thing or two about self-defense. More importantly, he knew that backing down now would only make things worse. Derek lunged first, throwing a wild punch that Christopher managed to dodge. The movement brought back memories of sparring with Tony at the youth center, practicing moves they'd learned from old martial arts videos. Christopher stepped inside Derek's reach, using the bigger boy's momentum against him, just as they'd practiced. Derek stumbled, caught off guard by Christopher's trained response. Kyle and Jason hesitated, clearly not expecting actual resistance. In that moment of uncertainty, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Ms. Parker, Christopher's English teacher, stood at the park entrance, her expression fierce. The bullies immediately backed away, their bravado deflating under adult supervision. "Nothing," Kyle muttered, shooting Christopher a venomous look. "We were just leaving." As the bullies skulked away, Ms. Parker approached Christopher and Dr. Chen. "Are you both all right?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. Dr. Chen nodded, still gripping his cane but standing straighter now. "Thanks to this young man," Dr. Chen said, turning to Christopher with grateful eyes. "He showed remarkable courage." Christopher felt his cheeks warm at the praise, embarrassment mixing with pride. "That's Christopher Harris," Ms. Parker said, smiling. "One of my best students, though he's cutting it close for his shift at Morton's right now." Christopher's eyes widened as he remembered work. He was already 15 minutes late. "I'm so sorry, I have to go," he said, grabbing his backpack. But Dr. Chen reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Wait, please. At least tell me your full name. I'd like to properly thank you." "Christopher Harris, sir," he replied, shifting anxiously. "But really, anyone would have done the same." Dr. Chen shook his head, a knowing look in his eyes. "No, young man, they wouldn't have, and I won't forget this." Christopher ran all the way to Morton's grocery, his mind racing. Mr. Morton was waiting at the door, his usual stern expression in place. "You're late, Harris." Christopher caught his breath, preparing to explain, but Mr. Morton held up a hand. "Ms. Parker called. Said you were helping someone in trouble." Relief flooded through Christopher as Mr. Morton's face softened slightly. "Get to work, but remember, next time call if you're going to be late." Christopher nodded gratefully, hurrying to don his apron. That evening, as Christopher stocked shelves and helped customers, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened. Not just the fight, but the way Dr. Chen had looked at him, like he'd done something extraordinary rather than simply what was right. When he finally got home, Diana was waiting up, James already asleep in their shared bedroom. "Ms. Parker called," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm proud of you for helping that man, but please be careful, Christopher. We can't afford hospital bills if those boys hurt you." Christopher hugged her back, feeling the tension in her shoulders, the weight of single parenthood and constant worry. "I'm okay, Mom. Really." But he didn't tell her about the way Kyle had looked at him as he left, or the whispered, "This isn't over," that had followed him down the street. As he lay in bed that night, listening to James's soft breathing from the other twin bed, Christopher wondered about the elderly man he'd helped. There had been something distinguished about him, despite his obvious vulnerability in that moment. Little did Christopher know that this encounter would set in motion events that would transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone he loved. The next morning, it dawned bright and crisp over Riverdale. Christopher woke early, his muscles sore from the previous day's confrontation. Through the thin walls of their apartment, he could hear his mother getting ready for her morning shift at Atlanta General Hospital, her footsteps careful not to wake James. Christopher slipped out of bed, mindful of his sleeping brother. In the kitchen, Diana was already in her scrubs, preparing James's lunch for school. "Morning, Mom," he said, reaching for the cereal box. She turned, dark circles under her eyes betraying another restless night. "Chris, I got a call from the hospital. They need me to work a double shift today." Her voice carried the familiar weight of apology. "Can you pick up James from school? I know you have work, but I'll figure it out," Christopher assured her, though he wasn't sure how. Mr. Morton had already been flexible about yesterday's tardiness. Asking for more schedule changes felt risky. As Christopher walked to school, the morning sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk, he noticed more eyes on him than usual. Word had spread about yesterday's incident. Some students nodded approvingly, while others whispered behind their hands. Near his locker, Tony waited with a worried expression. "Man, what were you thinking?" Tony asked, falling into step beside him. "Kyle's dad is on the school board. Those guys don't play around." Christopher shrugged, trying to appear more confident than he felt. "I can cover the first hour of your shift. Tell Morton you'll be late, but you're coming." Christopher hesitated. "Tony, you don't have to—" "Shut up and go get your brother," Tony interrupted with a grin. "Just don't make it a habit, okay?" Relief flooded through Christopher as he texted Mr. Morton the update. Sometimes, he realized, accepting help was its own kind of courage. As Christopher hurried toward James's elementary school, the events of the past 24 hours weighed heavily on his mind. The elderly man's grateful eyes, Kyle's threatening glare, Ms. Parker's words about his father, it all swirled together, making him question whether he'd done the right thing, even as he knew he couldn't have done anything else. Little did he know that across town, in a well-appointed office overlooking the Atlanta skyline, Dr. Walter Chen was having a very interesting conversation about the young man who had come to his aid. A conversation that would soon change everything. Dr. Walter Chen sat in his expansive office at the Cruz Medical Foundation, gazing out at the Atlanta skyline. His daughter, Chloe Cruz, paced before his desk, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Dad, you can't just show up unannounced at some kid's house. It's not appropriate." "He saved me from those thugs, Chloe," Walter replied, his voice firm despite his age. "And there's something about him. He reminds me of Michael." The name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Michael Cruz, Chloe's late husband, had been known for his charitable work before his passing 5 years ago. "I've done some research," Walter continued, pulling out a manila folder. "The Harris family has struggled since David Harris died 3 years ago. The mother, Diana, works as a nurse at Atlanta General. Christopher maintains excellent grades while working part-time. They're exactly the kind of family Michael would have wanted to help." Chloe stopped pacing, her expression softening. "Dad, I know you mean well, but—" She was interrupted by a knock at the door. Gregory McFell, their family's longtime financial advisor and friend, entered with his characteristic confident stride. "I've looked into everything, Walter," Gregory said, settling into a leather chair. The Harris boy's father was a community leader, ran youth programs, helped troubled kids. After his death, the family lost their house, moved to a small apartment. Christopher's been working since he was 12 to help make ends meet. Walter nodded, satisfaction evident in his features. And his intervention yesterday wasn't a one-time thing. According to my sources, he regularly volunteers at the youth center his father used to run, teaching younger kids despite his own busy schedule. Chloe sighed, recognizing the determined look in her father's eyes. "What exactly are you planning, Dad?" Walter smiled, the same smile that had built the Cruz Medical Foundation from nothing. "Gregory has some interesting proposals." Meanwhile, across town, Christopher was dealing with his own challenges. After picking up James from school, he'd rushed to Morton's grocery, grateful to find Tony had covered for him. Mr. Morton's stern expression had softened slightly at Christopher's breathless thanks. The evening shift dragged on, each hour marked by the constant worry about James, who sat doing homework in the store's break room. Christopher stocked shelves mechanically, his mind wandering to the events of the past day, to the elderly man he'd defended. "Your father would have done the same thing," Tony said during their break, passing Christopher a soda. "Remember when he stopped those guys from harassing Mrs. Jenkins at the community center?" Christopher nodded, the memory bittersweet. His father had always seemed to be there when people needed help, right until the day he wasn't anymore. As closing time approached, Christopher noticed a sleek black car pull up outside the store. Through the window, he could see Kyle and his friends lounging nearby, their poses deliberately casual, but their intent clear. They were waiting for him. "Take the back door," Mr. Morton said quietly, appearing beside Christopher. "I called your mother. She's sending someone to pick you and James up." Christopher started to protest, but Mr. Morton shook his head. "Some battles aren't worth fighting, son. Not when you've got family counting on you." Christopher gathered James and their belongings, exiting through the employee entrance. The night air was cool against his face as they waited in the shadows, watching Kyle and his friends grow increasingly impatient at the front of the store. A car turned into the alley, its headlights momentarily blinding them. Christopher tensed, pushing James behind him, but then the window rolled down, revealing Ms. Parker's familiar face. "Get in, quickly," she said, glancing toward the front of the store. As they drove home, Christopher couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in his world. Ms. Parker's intervention, Mr. Morton's protection, even Kyle's persistent threats. It all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle he couldn't quite see. "Your mom's working late again?" Ms. Parker asked, navigating through the quiet streets. Christopher nodded, guilt gnawing at him. James had fallen asleep in the back seat, his small face peaceful despite the tension surrounding them. "You know," Ms. Parker said softly, "your father once told me that true strength isn't about winning fights. It's about knowing which ones to walk away from and which ones are worth everything you've got." She glanced at him meaningfully. "Yesterday you chose right. Today you chose right again. That's what matters." As they pulled up to the apartment building, neither Christopher nor Ms. Parker noticed the expensive car parked discreetly across the street, its occupants watching with careful interest. Inside sat Walter Chen, Gregory McFell, and Chloe Cruz, their presence marking the beginning of a change that would reshape the Harris family's future. The next morning arrived with a sense of unease. Christopher woke before his alarm, the events of the previous night still fresh in his mind. Through the thin curtains, dawn painted their small bedroom in shades of gray. James slept soundly in the adjacent bed, clutching the worn stuffed bear their father had given him. Diana had returned late from her double shift, exhaustion etched deep in her features. Christopher could hear her now in the kitchen, preparing for another early morning at the hospital. The familiar sounds of coffee brewing and quiet movements brought both comfort and concern. How long could she keep pushing herself like this? As Christopher dressed for school, his phone buzzed with a text from Tony. "Kyle's looking for you. Says he's got unfinished business. Watch your back." Christopher's jaw tightened. He'd been hoping the Bullies would lose interest, but apparently they had other plans. The morning routine followed its usual pattern: a quick breakfast, helping James get ready, and the careful distribution of the last remaining lunch money between them. Diana hugged them both, her embrace lingering a moment longer than usual. "Be careful today," she whispered to Christopher. "Ms. Parker called me about last night. Those boys." "I'll be fine, Mom," Christopher assured her, though uncertainty gnawed at his stomach. "Just focus on work. I've got things handled here." Diana's eyes glistened with a mixture of pride and worry, but she merely nodded and headed out for her shift. The walk to school felt longer than usual, each shadow potentially hiding Kyle and his friends. Christopher kept James close, hyper-aware of their surroundings. They were nearly at James's elementary school when a sleek black Mercedes pulled up alongside them. Christopher's heart raced until the window rolled down, revealing Dr. Chen's familiar face. "Good morning, Christopher," the elderly man said warmly. "I was hoping to catch you before school." Behind him, Christopher could see a younger woman, presumably his daughter, watching with careful interest. "Mr. Chen," Christopher started, but the older man corrected him gently. "Dr. Chen, actually, and this is my daughter, Chloe Cruz." The woman offered a polite smile, but her eyes held something more calculating, as if she were solving a complex puzzle. "I wanted to properly thank you for your help the other day, Doctor." Chen continued. "Perhaps you and your family could join us for dinner this evening. There's something I'd like to discuss with your mother as well." Christopher hesitated, glancing at James, who watched the exchange with wide-eyed curiosity. "I have work after school," he began, but Dr. Chen waved away his concern. "I've already spoken with Mr. Morton. He's agreed to give you the evening off, with pay." The mention of his employer caught Christopher off guard. Just how much influence did this man have? Before he could respond, another car appeared, Kyle's father's expensive SUV. Christopher tensed, instinctively moving to shield James. Dr. Chen noticed the change in Christopher's demeanor and followed his gaze. His expression hardened slightly. "Is there a problem with those young men?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Nothing I can't handle," Christopher replied, trying to sound confident. Chloe Cruz exchanged a meaningful look with her father before addressing Christopher directly. "Let us drive you and your brother to school. We insist." Something in her voice brooked no argument, and Christopher found himself agreeing. As they settled into the luxury vehicle, he caught a glimpse of Kyle's frustrated expression as their SUV drove past. James bounced excitedly on the leather seats, his earlier sleepiness forgotten in the face of such unexpected adventure. The car ride was brief but enlightening. Dr. Chen asked casual questions about their lives, their interests, their dreams. Each answer seemed to confirm something for him, though Christopher couldn't guess what. When they reached James's school, Chloe Cruz herself walked him to the entrance, her protective presence ensuring no trouble from any lingering bullies. "We'll send a car for your family at 7, Dr. Chen said as they reached Riverdale High. "There's much to discuss." Something in his tone suggested this was more than a simple thank you dinner, but Christopher couldn't begin to guess what lay ahead. As he watched the Mercedes pull away, Christopher felt the weight of eyes on him. Students whispered and pointed, but for once, it wasn't about yesterday's confrontation. The mysterious car, the well-dressed visitors, in a neighborhood like Riverdale, such things didn't go unnoticed. Tony appeared at his side, whistling low. "Man, what kind of trouble did you get yourself into?" Christopher shook his head, still processing the morning's events. "I have no idea," he replied honestly, "but I guess I'll find out tonight." The evening cast long shadows across Riverdale as Christopher helped Diana prepare for their mysterious dinner engagement. James bounced around their small apartment, already dressed in his best clothes, a slightly too small button-up shirt and khaki pants from last year's school photos. "I still don't understand," Diana said, adjusting her simple black dress, the one she saved for special occasions. "This Dr. Chen, he wants to thank you with dinner at the Cruz Foundation?" Her voice carried equal measures of pride and apprehension. Christopher explained again about the incident, Dr. Chen's position, and the morning's strange encounter. He omitted the part about Kyle's SUV, not wanting to add to his mother's worries. "There's something else," he added hesitantly. "The way Dr. Chen talked about it. I think there's more to this dinner than just saying thank you." Before Diana could respond, a soft knock at their door made them all freeze. Christopher opened it to find a professionally dressed chauffeur. "Good evening. Dr. Chen sent me to escort the Harris family." The ride to the Cruz Foundation building was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. James pressed his face against the tinted window, watching the city transform from their modest neighborhood to the gleaming business district. Diana held Christopher's hand tightly, her palm slightly damp with nervous energy. The Foundation's headquarters was an impressive glass and steel structure that seemed to touch the darkening sky. In the lobby, Chloe Cruz waited to greet them, her silk blazer and pearl necklace making Diana unconsciously smooth her department store dress. "Welcome," Chloe said warmly, through her eyes holding that same calculating look from the morning. "Please follow me." She led them to a private elevator, using a key card to access the top floor. The doors opened directly into a luxurious dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Atlanta's skyline. Dr. Chen stood at the head of an elegantly set table, while a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, Gregory McFell as he soon introduced himself, sat nearby reviewing documents. "Diana Harris," Dr. Chen said, stepping forward to shake her hand. "Your son is quite remarkable." Diana's smile was proud but guarded. "Thank you, though I'm still not entirely sure why we're here." "Please sit, Doctor." Chen gestured to the table. "All will become clear over dinner." As they settled into their seats, Christopher noticed several manila folders near Gregory McFell's elbow, one labeled with their family name. The first course arrived, a soup Christopher couldn't pronounce but James enthusiastically devoured. Dr. Chen asked casual questions about their lives, their interests, their struggles. Each answer seemed to confirm something for him and McFell, who took occasional notes. "Mrs. Harris," McFell said during the main course, "are you familiar with the Cruz Foundation's Community Investment Program?" Diana shook her head, and McFell continued. "We identify promising families, people with potential who faced unfortunate circumstances, and help them rebuild their lives." Christopher's fork paused halfway to his mouth as understanding began to dawn. Dr. Chen smiled at his reaction. "Your father, David Harris, was known for his community work. When Christopher helped me, he showed the same spirit of selfless service. It made me curious about your family." "What exactly are you proposing?" Diana asked, her nurse's practicality cutting through the diplomatic language. Dr. Chen nodded to McFell, who opened one of his folders. "We'd like to offer Christopher a full scholarship through college," McFell began. "Additionally, we want to help your family move to a better neighborhood, closer to both the hospital and Christopher's school. We've also arranged for a position for you, Mrs. Harris, in our foundation's medical division. Better hours, significantly better pay." Diana's hand trembled as she set down her water glass. "This is overwhelming. Why would you do all this for us?" "Because," Dr. Chen said softly, "sometimes the right people just need the right opportunity. But there's something else you should know." He glanced at Chloe, who nodded encouragingly. "Your husband, David. I knew him, though he wouldn't have remembered me. Years ago, he helped my grandson through a very difficult time at that community center of his. I never got to thank him." The weight of this revelation settled over the table, like a heavy blanket. Christopher stared at Dr. Chen, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving falling into place. This wasn't just about his act of kindness. It was about legacy, about debts unpaid, and second chances. In the dimly lit dining room of the Cruz Foundation, silence hung heavy as the implications of Dr. Chen's words sank in. Christopher's mind raced back to countless afternoons at the community center, watching his father work with troubled youth. How many lives had David Harris touched without ever knowing the ripple effects? "Your grandson," Diana said softly. "What was his name?" Dr. Chen's eyes grew distant with memory. "Michael Cruz. He later became my son-in-law." Beside him, Chloe smiled sadly. "My late husband." Gregory McFell cleared his throat gently, opening another folder. "There's more. David Harris helped establish several youth programs that the Cruz Foundation later funded. His work laid the groundwork for initiatives that have helped hundreds of kids across Atlanta. We've been trying to track down his family for years." Diana's hands trembled as she reached for old photographs McFell spread across the table. Images of David at the community center, working with teenagers, including a young man Christopher now recognized as Michael Cruz. "He never talked about where the funding came from," she whispered. "He just said good people were helping." "Dad was always like that," Christopher added, his voice thick with emotion. "He cared more about helping people than getting credit." James, who had been unusually quiet, reached for one of the photos, tracing their father's smile with a small finger. Dr. Chen leaned forward, his expression earnest. "When you stood up to those bullies, Christopher, you showed the same courage and compassion your father was known for. But learning about your family's struggles, knowing how David's death left you all vulnerable, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Not again." "What do you mean, not again?" Christopher asked, catching something in the older man's tone. Dr. Chen exchanged a glance with his daughter before continuing. "We tried to help after David's death, but we couldn't locate your family. You'd moved, changed numbers. By the time we traced you to Riverdale, years had passed." He paused, regret evident in his features. "Michael always said we owed David Harris everything. He wanted to repay that debt." Chloe spoke up, her professional demeanor softening. "Michael died before he could find you. When Dad told me about Christopher's intervention, about who he was, it felt like more than coincidence. It felt like a second chance." Gregory McFell produced more documents, spreading them carefully on the table. "These are the formal proposals we discussed earlier. The scholarship, the job offer, housing assistance. But there's something else." He pulled out a final folder, this one older, its edges worn. This is the trust Michael set up years ago, intended for David Harris's family. It's been waiting for you. Diana's breath caught as she saw the figures. Christopher glimpsed numbers that made his head spin, enough to change their lives completely, to secure their future, to honor his father's legacy in ways they'd never imagined possible. I don't know what to say, Diana managed, tears flowing freely now. Dr. Chen reached across the table, his aged hand covering hers. Say you'll let us help. Let us do what should have been done years ago. James, who had been studying the photographs intently, suddenly spoke up. Dad helped people, he said with the simple clarity of a child. Now people want to help us, isn't that good? The adults exchanged glances, smiling through tears at James's innocent wisdom. Christopher felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting, a door opening. His father's absence would always hurt, but knowing his work, his compassion, had created such lasting impact filled a void he hadn't realized existed. There's one condition, Doctor, Chen added, his eyes twinkling. Christopher needs to continue his father's work at the community center. Those kids need someone to look up to, just like Michael needed David all those years ago. Our work here is just beginning, Gregory McFell announced the next morning, leading the Harris family through their potential new home. A beautiful 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood near Atlanta General Hospital. The morning sun streamed through large windows, illuminating hardwood floors and freshly painted walls. Diana moved through the rooms in quiet awe, her fingers trailing along smooth countertops. James darted from space to space, exclaiming over things Christopher had never thought possible for them. A backyard with actual grass, bedrooms that didn't share walls, a kitchen big enough for family meals. The previous owners accepted our offer, McFell explained, watching their reactions with satisfaction. We can have you moved in by the end of the week. He paused, checking his phone. Dr. Chen is meeting us at the community center in an hour. There are some people there eager to see you. The drive to the center was surreal. Christopher watched familiar streets give way to the neighborhood where they'd lived before his father's death. The community center looked smaller than he remembered, its brick facade weathered but well-maintained. A crowd had gathered outside, familiar faces from years past mixed with new ones. Ms. Parker stood among them, beaming. Beside her, Tony shifted nervously, clearly wondering why he'd been invited. But it was the 3 figures at the back of the crowd that caught Christopher's attention. Kyle, Derek, and Jason, looking uncommonly subdued. Dr. Chen stepped forward as they arrived, addressing the assembled group. Many of you knew David Harris, he began, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Some of you were helped by his programs. Others worked alongside him. Today we're announcing the revival of those programs, under new leadership. Christopher felt all eyes turn to him as Dr. Chen continued. Christopher Harris will be taking up his father's mantle with full funding from the Cruz Foundation. But first, he turned to Kyle and his friends, there are some young men here who have something to say. Kyle stepped forward, his usual swagger replaced by genuine discomfort. We didn't know about your dad, he said to Christopher. Ms. Parker told us everything, how he helped kids like us, gave them a second chance. He swallowed hard. Dr. Chen offered us a choice, face charges for harassment or join the program. We chose the program. The irony wasn't lost on Christopher. His father had specialized in working with troubled teens, showing them better paths. Now the very boys who'd threatened him would be among his first charges. Tony broke the tension, stepping forward with a grin. Well, if we're all sharing news, Ms. Parker offered me a job here too. Said you'd need a good assistant. He nudged Christopher playfully. Just like old times, huh? The crowd began to mingle, sharing stories about David Harris, discussing plans for new programs. Diana stood with Chloe Cruz deep in conversation about healthcare initiatives they could implement. James had already gathered a group of younger kids, showing them basketball tricks their father had taught him. Gregory McFell appeared at Christopher's side, watching the scene with satisfaction. Your father believed one act of kindness could change everything, he said quietly. Look around. He was right. Your kindness toward Dr. Chen didn't just change your family's life, it's going to change this whole community. Christopher nodded, emotion thick in his throat. In less than a week, his world had transformed. Yet somehow, standing here where his father had worked, watching old divisions heal and new connections form, it felt like coming home. Ms. Parker joined them, her eyes bright with unshed tears. David always said the center wasn't just about keeping kids out of trouble, she remembered. It was about showing them their own worth, their potential to help others. Christopher, you've been doing that all along, even without realizing it. Days turned into weeks as the Harris family settled into their new life. Christopher stood in their new kitchen, watching the sunrise through windows that actually sealed properly against the morning chill. The smell of coffee, a luxury they could now afford regularly, filled the air as Diana prepared for her first day at her new position with the Cruz Foundation's medical division. Nervous? Christopher asked, noting how she smoothed her new blazer for the 10th time. Diana smiled, a hint of her old weariness still lingering beneath fresh hope. A little. It's strange, isn't it? How quickly has everything changed? Before Christopher could respond, James bounded down the stairs, already dressed for school. Mom! Chris, look what I found! He held up a dusty photo album they'd discovered while unpacking, memories from their old life that somehow felt both distant and immediate. The photos captured moments at the community center. David Harris teaching self-defense classes, organizing basketball tournaments, mediating conflicts between troubled teens. Christopher traced his father's smile in one particular image, understanding now why Dr. Chen had recognized something familiar in him that day. Your father would be proud, Diana said softly, joining them at the kitchen counter. Not just of the programs you're reviving, but of how you're handling everything. She gestured to a newspaper article pinned to their new refrigerator, highlighting the Cruz Foundation's community initiatives under Christopher's leadership. The transition hadn't been easy. Some people questioned whether a teenager could effectively run such important programs. Others, particularly parents of wealthier students, were hesitant about their kids mixing with Riverdale's less privileged youth. But Christopher had inherited his father's patience and determination. Later that morning at the community center, Christopher watched Kyle and his former gang working with younger kids on the basketball court. Their transformation over the past weeks had been remarkable. Under Christopher's guidance, they'd discovered what his father had always preached, that helping others was the surest way to help yourself. Tony approached, clipboard in hand. The new equipment's arriving this afternoon, he reported. And Ms. Parker says registration for the summer programs is already double what they expected. He paused, studying his friend's expression. You okay? You've got that look. Christopher nodded, watching as Kyle patiently showed a younger boy how to improve his shooting form. Just thinking about Dad. Remember how he used to say every kid deserves a second chance? He gestured toward Kyle's group. I don't think I really understood what he meant until now. The center had become a symbol of transformation, not just for the Harris family, but for the entire community. Dr. Chen's investment had sparked others' interest. Local businesses began offering internships, colleges sent recruiters, and former troubled teens returned as mentors. Chloe Cruz appeared in the doorway, her professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth. Christopher, do you have a moment? There's someone I'd like you to meet. She stepped aside, revealing a tall man in his early 20s, another of David Harris's success stories, now a law student wanting to give back. As Christopher led them on a tour of the facility, he couldn't help but reflect on the chain of events that had brought them here. One moment of courage, standing up to bullies in defense of an elderly stranger, had unlocked a door to his father's legacy. But it wasn't just about honoring the past. It was about building something new. Your father believed in the ripple effect, Chloe explained later, watching kids filter in for afternoon programs. How one positive action could inspire countless others. He probably never imagined how his own actions would ripple forward, touching lives years after he was gone. Months passed, and autumn painted Riverdale in shades of gold and crimson. Christopher sat in his office at the community center, the same space his father had once occupied, reviewing progress reports on their expanding programs. The walls were covered with photos, his father's old images mixed with new ones, creating a visual timeline of transformation. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Kyle stood there, looking markedly different from the bully he'd been just months ago. "Got a minute, Chris? There's something I need to talk about." Christopher gestured to the chair across from his desk, noting the tension in Kyle's shoulders. "What's up? Remember those kids from Grant High? The ones giving our younger members trouble?" Kyle's voice carried a new maturity. "I think I can help. I used to be like them, you know? Maybe if I share my story." Christopher smiled, remembering similar conversations with his father years ago. "That's exactly what these programs are about, Kyle. Using our experiences to help others." Their discussion was interrupted by Gregory McFell, who arrived with quarterly reports from the Cruz Foundation. The numbers were impressive: decreased dropout rates, improved academic performance, reduced juvenile crime in the areas they served. "Your father's vision, combined with your implementation, has exceeded our expectations," McFell noted, spreading charts across the desk. "The board wants to expand the program to other neighborhoods." Later that afternoon, Christopher watched from the gymnasium doorway as Kyle shared his story with a group of troubled teens. The same passion that had once fueled his bullying now powered his desire to help others. It was a transformation that would have made David Harris proud. Diana visited during her lunch break, her hospital ID badge now bearing the Cruz Foundation logo. She paused in the hallway, studying a new mural the kids had painted. A tree with countless branches, each leaf bearing the name of someone who'd been helped by the center. "Sometimes I see your father in you so clearly," she said softly, watching Christopher interact with a group of younger children. "But you're building something uniquely yours here, too." The afternoon brought a surprise visit from Dr. Chen and Chloe Cruz. They gathered in the conference room, joined by Ms. Parker and Tony, to discuss the center's future. The room buzzed with energy as they planned new initiatives, expanded programs, and ways to reach more families in need. "Michael always said your father had a gift," Dr. Chen remarked, his eyes twinkling. "He could see the potential in people even when they couldn't see it themselves. You have that same gift, Christopher." As evening approached, Christopher found himself alone in his office again, holding a framed photo of his father. The man's warm smile seemed to hold all the wisdom Christopher was still learning to embrace. A commotion outside drew his attention. Through the window, he watched as Kyle and his former gang members organized a pickup basketball game, deliberately mixing younger kids with older ones, troubled teens with honor students. The barriers that had once divided their community were dissolving, replaced by understanding and connection. Tony appeared in the doorway, grinning. "Just like old times, huh? Except now we're the ones running things." He paused, studying his friend. "You know what your dad used to say about moments like this?" Christopher nodded, completing the familiar phrase. "It's not about where you start, but how you choose to move forward." The center had become more than just a safe space. It was a catalyst for change, a testament to the power of second chances, and a living tribute to David Harris's legacy. But more than that, it was proof that one act of kindness, one moment of courage, could spark a transformation that touched countless lives. 1 year later, Christopher stood at the podium in the community center's newly renovated auditorium, addressing a packed house. The occasion was the first anniversary of the revived David Harris youth programs, and the atmosphere buzzed with accomplishment and possibility. "A year ago," Christopher began, his voice steady and sure, "I stood up for a stranger because it was the right thing to do. I didn't know then that one moment would change everything, not just for my family, but for our entire community." The audience included faces both familiar and new. Dr. Chen and Chloe Cruz in the front row, Gregory McFell taking notes nearby, Diana and James beaming with pride. Kyle and his former gang, now program leaders themselves, sat with their group of mentees. Even some of the teens they'd helped steer away from trouble had returned to share their stories. Ms. Parker wiped tears as Christopher continued. My father believed that every person deserves a chance to rewrite their story. He understood that sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you, one opportunity to prove yourself, one moment of kindness to change everything. The statistics projected behind him told a compelling story. Juvenile crime rates down 60% in their area, high school graduation rates up, college acceptance letters hanging proudly on the center's wall of dreams. But the real success stories sat in that very room. Former adversaries, now friends, troubled teens turned mentors, broken families healing together. Tony joined Christopher at the podium, presenting their plans for the coming year. Satellite centers in neighboring communities, partnership programs with local businesses, scholarship initiatives for program graduates. The Cruz Foundation had committed to matching all community donations, ensuring the program's future. After the ceremony, during the reception, Dr. Chen pulled Christopher aside. Your father once told Michael that the true measure of success isn't in the lives you touch directly, but in how those lives touch others. He gestured to where Kyle was introducing some younger kids to college recruiters. You've created a ripple effect that will continue long after we're gone. Diana, now a senior administrator at the Cruz Foundation's medical division, watched her son with quiet pride. James, growing tall and confident like his brother, helped distribute awards to program participants. Their new life felt both miraculous and entirely natural, as if all paths had been leading here. Later that evening, Christopher found himself alone in his office, looking at the dual photos on his desk. His father in the same room years ago, and himself now, continuing the legacy. He thought about the chain of events, a moment of courage, an act of kindness, hidden connections revealed and lives transformed. A knock at his door revealed Kyle, Derek, and Jason. We've been thinking, Kyle said, about starting a mentorship program for kids transitioning from juvenile detention. Give them a chance, like you gave us. Christopher smiled, recognizing his father's spirit living on through each person touched by his programs. Dad always said everyone deserves a second chance, he replied. Let's make it happen. As night fell over Atlanta, the community center's light still burned bright, a beacon of hope in a world that sometimes forgot the power of simple kindness. Christopher's story had come full circle, from defending a stranger to defending his father's legacy, from receiving help to helping others. The next morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new lives to touch. But for now, Christopher stood in the quiet building, surrounded by the echoes of laughter, learning, and transformation, knowing that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single step, a single choice, a single moment of courage that changes everything. His father's words, painted on the wall above the entrance, said it all. Kindness ripples forward, touching lives we may never know, changing stories we may never hear, but making the world better, one heart at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.